A fork trembled in my hand as I stared at the empty chair across from me, the one where my brother should have been sitting on. Thanksgiving 2019, except he'd been dead for 3 weeks, and nobody had thought to remove his place setting. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The silence around that table was the kind that presses against your eardrums, a kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat, the scrape of your own breathing. My mother had set the table the night before, methodically placing each dish and glass and folded napkin the way she had for 37 years. The way she always did, as if ritual could somehow resurrect the dead or at least make their absence less obscene. She'd even put out Marcus's favorite wine glass, the one with the chipped base that he refused to let her throw away because he drunk from it the night he got engaged the night before the car accident that meant there would never be a wedding. I should tell you that this story isn't really about my brother, or it is, but it isn't. The way all stories about absence are really about presence, about the weight of what isn't there, the gravitational pull of empty space. This is a story about tables, and the meals we gather around, and the ghosts we seat among us, sometimes knowingly, sometimes because we can't help it, because memory has its own chair at every table, and takes up more room than any living person ever could. My mother's hands shook when she brought out the turkey that year, and I watched as she placed it in the center of the table right between Marcus's untouched plate and my father's, and my father looked at her, the way you look at someone who is walking too close to the edge of a cliff. We didn't say grace that year, not the way we usually did, holding hands in a circle and taking turns listing what we were grateful for. Instead, we sat in that pressurized silence, and I thought about all the other tables across the country, across the world, that had empty chairs nobody wanted to acknowledge, places set for people who would never arrive. The thing about absence is that it's not passive. It doesn't just sit there quietly in the background. Absence is active, aggressive even, the way it inserts itself into every conversation, every glance. Every moment when someone almost says the wrong name or starts to tell a story before remembering that half the people who would understand the reference are no longer here to hear it. That Thanksgiving Marcus's absence was so loud, I could barely hear my own thoughts, let alone the quiet attempts at conversation. My parents kept making these little lifeboats of normalcy. They'd toss into the drowning silence before another wave of grief pulled them under. I'd been thinking about that dinner for weeks before I started researching this phenomenon. This thing we do with empty chairs and place settings for the dead. I wanted to know if we were strange, if our family's inability to clear Marcus' spot from the table meant we were failing at grief, somehow doing it wrong, getting stuck in some early stage that healthier people moved past. What I found instead was that we were part of a tradition as old as tables themselves, as ancient as the first time someone set out food for a person who would never eat it. The Romans did it, leaving a place at the feast for the Lares, the household gods who were really just deified ancestors, the family's protective dead. They set out food and wine and make offerings at every meal because they understood something we there tried to forget in our modern sanitized relationship with death, that the dead don't actually leave our tables, not in any way that matters. They're always there, taking up space, demanding to be fed, refusing to be forgotten. In Jewish tradition, there's the custom of leaving a seat for Elijah at the Passover Seder, a place set for the prophet who never arrives, but whose potential arrival transforms the entire meal into an act of hope, of waiting, of faith in things unseen. The empty chair becomes a threshold, a doorway between this world and whatever comes next, between memory and prophecy, between the dead who haunt us and the future we can't yet see. I started asking people about their empty chairs, their missing guests, their tables with gaps that nobody wants to fill. I put out a call on social media, posted in grief forums, contacted support groups, and the stories that came back to me were overwhelming in their volume and their similarity, as if we're all sitting at the same vast, ghostly table, all staring at the same constellation of empty seats. A woman named Jennifer wrote to me about her daughter's high chair, how it had stayed in the corner of their kitchen for 2 years after the leukemia finally won, how she and her husband would eat dinner with that tiny chair in their peripheral vision, neither of them willing to be the one who suggested moving it, getting rid of it, acknowledging that their daughter would never sit in it again. She said they'd finally stored it in the basement when they got pregnant with their son, and that she'd cried for 3 days straight, not because she was replacing her daughter, but because removing the chair felt like killing her all over again, erasing the last physical evidence that she'd once taken up space in their home. Michael told me about his grandfather's recliner at the head of the dining table, how for 5 Christmases after the old man died, they'd worked around it, squeezing extra people onto one side rather than remove his chair, until finally, Michael's youngest cousin, who'd never even met their grandfather, asked why they were all cramped together when there was a perfectly good empty seat right there. The spell broke, Michael said, and they moved the chair, and he still doesn't know if that was a betrayal or a release. There was Anna, whose husband died in Iraq, and who set a place for him at every meal for 6 months, including breakfast, including lunch on workdays, when she ate alone at the kitchen counter, until one morning her therapist asked her who she was really feeding, and the question made her so angry she didn't eat at all that day. She stopped setting his place after that, she told me, but sometimes she still catches herself reaching for an extra plate, still calculates portions for 2, still buys his favorite foods at the grocery store before remembering. The stories kept coming, and I began to see patterns, themes, the different ways we handle these absences, these empty chairs. Some people fill them immediately, eager to move forward, to assert that life continues, that the table is for the living. Others preserve them like shrines, untouchable, sacrosanct, proof that someone mattered enough to leave a permanent scar on the family's geography. And then there are those like my family, who exist in some liminal space between acknowledgement and denial, setting the place, but not eating from it, honoring the absence without quite accepting its permanence. I talked to a cultural anthropologist who studies dying rituals across societies, and she told me that every culture she'd examined had some version of this practice, some way of incorporating the dead into meals, because eating together is how we define community, how we establish who belongs to us. To exclude someone from the table is to cast them out of the family, out of the tribe, and death doesn't automatically confer that kind of exile. We need time to disinvite our dead, she said, to gradually remove them from our inner circle, and the table is where that negotiation happens, one meal at a time. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead isn't just a celebration, but a massive dinner party where the deceased are the guests of honor, where families build elaborate altars that are really just specialized tables, covered with the favorite foods and drinks of those who've died, presented not as offerings to distant gods, but as actual meals for actual people who are expected to show up and consume them, at least spiritually. The logic is impeccable. If we are what we eat, then feeding our dead is a way of keeping them alive, keeping them part of us, incorporating them literally and metaphorically into the ongoing life of the family. I started looking at historical accounts of feasts and banquets, and I found empty chairs everywhere, though not always for the dead. Medieval kings would sometimes leave a place at their table for Christ, acknowledging that God was present at their feast, participating in their community, entitled to a share of their food. At state dinners, there'd be chairs for allies who couldn't attend, for distant monarchs who are present in spirit through their ambassadors, for the abstract concept of peace or prosperity or whatever virtue the host wanted to invoke. During the Vietnam War, the American military developed the tradition of the missing man table, set for one at official functions, draped in white, holding a single rose, a slice of lemon, salt, an inverted glass, and an empty chair, each element symbolizing some aspect of absence, of waiting, of prisoners, and missing service members who might still return. The table is small, set apart, an island of potential return in a sea of certainty, and it's guarded, protected, treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for altars or graves. That tradition spread to civilian life, to weddings where brides and grooms honor deceased parents, or grandparents with empty chairs draped in flowers to graduation. Ceremonies where a seat remains unfilled for the classmate who didn't make it to commencement, to birthday. Parties where someone insists on setting a place for the friend who died too young. We are a culture obsessed with absence, I realized, with making the invisible visible, with giving shape and space to what is no longer there. I went to a dinner party where the host, a woman named Catherine, had set an extra place between every pair of guests' empty plates, interspersed among the full ones in a pattern that made the table look half deserted, even though it was completely occupied. When I asked her about it, she said she was representing all the people who weren't there, the ones we'd lost touch with, the friendships that had drifted away, the lovers who'd left, the family members estranged or dead or simply too far away to visit. She wanted us to eat an awareness of our incompleteness, she said, to recognize that every gathering is also a catalog of absences, that who isn't at the table matters as much as who is. It was one of the most uncomfortable meals I've ever attended, that dinner at Catherine's house, because every time I reached for my wine, I'd brush against an empty chair. Every conversation was interrupted by the visual reminder of gaps in our circle, and I found myself talking to the absences, to the empty plates, telling them about my day, my life, my thoughts, as if the dead and distant could hear me through the symbolic place settings. Other guests did the same thing I noticed, addressing remarks to the empty spaces, and Catherine smiled, as if this was exactly what she'd wanted, this communion with our missing, this acknowledgement that our tables are always haunted, always incomplete. There's a Buddhist practice I learned of feeding hungry ghosts, restless spirits who are trapped between worlds by their attachments, their unsatisfied desires, their inability to let go of life. Monks would set out food for these ghosts, elaborate meals that would be consumed not by the spirits themselves, but by animals, insects, the wind, the earth. A way of giving sustenance to the hungry dead, while also accepting the reality of their absence, their inability to actually eat. The ritual acknowledges both the reality of death and the persistence of our need to feed those we've lost, to continue the basic act of care that defines family, friendship, love. My mother eventually stopped setting Marcus's place, though it took her almost a year, and she did it without ceremony or announcement, just one dinner when I came home to visit, and noticed that the table was set for 3 instead of 4 that his chair had been, pushed in tight against the table as if to make it smaller, less noticeable, as if furniture could learn to take up less space. She didn't mention it, and neither did I, but my father caught my eye across the table and nodded slightly, a tiny acknowledgement that something had shifted, that we were entering a new phase of absence, one where Marcus was still missing, but no longer expected. But absence doesn't work that way, I've learned. Doesn't follow a linear progression from acute to manageable to resolved. Some days the empty chair is just a chair, no more meaningful than any other piece of furniture. And some days it's a sinkhole, a vortex, a black hole that sucks all the light and air and normalcy out of the room. Grief isn't something you move through and past. I've come to understand it's something you orbit, circling at varying distances, sometimes close enough to feel the heat, sometimes far enough away that you can almost pretend it's not there. I attended a dinner for the dead, an event organized by a grief support organization, where everyone brought a photograph of someone they lost, and we set the table with all these images propped against plates and glasses, these faces staring at us as we ate. Hundreds of dead people invited to a meal they couldn't consume. We were asked to talk about them, to tell stories, to keep them alive through narrative. And I watched as the woman next to me introduced her son, bed at 19 from a heroin overdose. And the way her voice changed when she said his name became softer, younger, as if speaking to him made her his mother again, not just someone whose child had died. The stories around that table were devastating and ordinary, in equal measure. Tales of cancer and car accidents and suicides and murders and stillbirths and old age and sudden heart attacks and slow declines and every other way that death inserts itself into life. But what struck me most was how similar all the stories were in their essence, how every person there was really telling the same story, which was simply, someone was here and now they're not, and I don't know how to eat dinner without them, without considering their preferences, their tastes, their presence across the table from me. A man named David told us about his wife's seat on the back porch where they drunk coffee every morning for 30 years. How he still makes 2 cups, still carries hers out, and sets it on the arm of her empty chair, still says good morning to the space where she used to be. He knows she's not there, he said. He's not delusional, but the ritual makes her more there than she would be otherwise, keeps her part of his morning routine, resists the erasure that death attempts to impose. There's something about eating together that's fundamental to our humanity. Anthropologists told me, something that predates agriculture, language, maybe even tool use. We've been gathering around fires and sharing food for hundreds of thousands of years, and every time we do it, we're reenacting an ancient ceremony, affirming our membership in the tribe, in the family, in the category of people who matter to each other enough to share resources. To exclude someone from that circle is a form of death, and to die is to be excluded. So we resist by continuing to set places, continuing to save seats, continuing to make room for those who are no longer there. I started paying attention to how restaurants handle this, the logistics of empty chairs at commercial tables, and I noticed that servers are trained to remove extra place settings immediately, to eliminate any evidence of absence, to pretend that every table is exactly as full as it's meant to be. It's a kindness, I suppose, but also a erasure, a refusal to acknowledge that most of us are eating with ghosts, with memories of other meals, other companions, other times when this same table held different people. There was a restaurant in Portland where a regular customer had died suddenly, and the staff couldn't bring themselves to seat anyone at his usual table for weeks afterward, would lie to customers and tell them it was reserved, would skip over it in the rotation, even on the busiest nights, until finally the owner put up a small plaque dedicating the table to the deceased man's memory. And after that, people could sit there again because the absence had been acknowledged, named, given official status. I interviewed a woman who worked as a wedding planner, and she told me that memorial tables had become increasingly popular at receptions. Elaborate displays with photographs of deceased family members' candles, flowers, sometimes empty chairs, arranged around them as if the dead were having their own private party, adjacent to the living one. She said it made her uncomfortable at first, this importing of death into celebrations, but she'd come to see it as healthy, as honest, as a recognition that every wedding is also a funeral for all the relationships that ended, all the people who didn't live to see this day, all the versions of ourselves we had to kill to become who we are now. The table as a site of transformation, I thought, not just of food, but of relationships, of identities, of the stories we tell about ourselves. We are different people at different tables, with different companions, and when someone disappears from our table, we have to become someone new, someone who eats without them, who passes dishes to other hands, who tells stories they'll never hear. I went to a Christmas dinner at my aunt's house, where my cousin had hung photographs of deceased family members on the wall behind the table, a gallery of the dead watching us eat, and my uncle joked nervously about being judged by our ancestors, about how Grandpa would have hated the store-bought pie, how Great-Aunt Eleanor would have disapproved of the wine we were drinking. But underneath the jokes was a real awareness of being watched, of performing our family identity for an audience that included ghosts, of eating under the gaze of those who'd once sat in our very chairs, who'd established the traditions we were now attempting to maintain. There is a Japanese practice of keeping a photograph of deceased family members on a small altar in the home, offering them food and drink daily, speaking to them about family news, treating them as if they're still present, still interested, still part of the household. It's not considered morbid or unhealthy, but simply proper. A recognition that death doesn't end relationship, doesn't terminate our obligations to one another, doesn't excuse us from the basic courtesies of family life. I talked to a gerontologist who studies aging and death, and she told me that one of the most devastating aspects of growing old is watching your table shrink, seeing more and more empty chairs accumulate, until you're the last person left from your original cohort eating alone or with strangers, the only one who remembers how full the table used to be. The loneliness of survival, she called it, the burden of being the one who remains when everyone else is gone. She told me about visiting elderly patients in care facilities who talk about their dead spouses, parents, siblings, as if they were still alive, still present, still part of their daily lives, and how the staff would sometimes try to correct them to remind them that these people had died, as if acknowledging reality was more important than maintaining connection. But who is reality really serving in those moments? She asked me. Who benefits from forced acceptance of absence when the presence of memory is doing no harm? I thought about my mother setting Marcus's place for those months after his death, and how everyone kept telling her she needed to stop, needed to accept that he was gone, needed to move on, as if these were simple tasks like doing laundry or paying bills. What they didn't understand was that setting his place was her way of moving on, her method of gradually transitioning from expecting him to walk through the door to understanding that he never would. A slow letting go that looked from the outside like denial, but from the inside felt like the only kind of goodbye she could manage. There is a difference between refusing to accept death and refusing to accept the erasure that death tries to impose. I realized between denial and defiance, between delusion and devotion. Setting a place for the dead isn't crazy. It's the opposite of crazy. It's a radical insistence on the ongoing reality of relationship, on the persistence of love beyond the boundary of life, on the right of the dead to continue occupying space in our homes, our hearts, our tables. I started experimenting with this myself, setting an extra place at my own small table when I ate alone, and I found that who occupied that place changed night to night, sometimes Marcus, sometimes my grandmother who died when I was 12, sometimes friends I'd lost track of, sometimes versions of myself that no longer existed, the person I was before trauma, before loss, before I understood that everyone at every table is temporary, that we all just borrowing our chairs for a little while before we become the empty place. Someone else has to figure out how to navigate around. The empty chair became a portal, I found, a way of accessing memories and conversations I thought were lost, of continuing relationships I'd assumed were finished, of feeding parts of myself that had been starving for attention, for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement that they'd once existed and mattered. I'd cook elaborate meals and eat them across from that empty chair and talk out loud about my day, my worries, my hopes. And it didn't matter that no one was listening. Or maybe someone was. Or maybe the act of speaking was itself the point, the way prayer works, regardless of whether anyone's receiving it. A therapist I interviewed told me that many of her clients found comfort in continuing to cook deceased loved ones. Favorite meals, setting their places, even serving their portions as a way of maintaining connection, of keeping skills and knowledge alive, of resisting the amnesia that grief can bring. One woman made her husband's signature chili every Sunday for 5 years after his death, even though she didn't particularly like chili, because the recipe was his and making it made him present, made him the author of something she consumed, incorporated his essence literally into her body through the food he taught her to prepare. This is cannibalism by other means, I thought. This eating of the dead through their favorite foods, through the meals they taught us to cook, through the dishes that carry their memories. We consume our ghosts at every meal, digest them, make them part of our cellular structure, our flesh and blood and bone, until the distinction between living and dead, between present and absent, between here and gone becomes meaningless, because they're always inside us, always part of us, always at our table, because they are. Our table, the foundation on which we build our appetites, our tastes, our understanding of what nourishment means. I went to a potluck where everyone brought a dish associated with someone they'd lost, and the table was covered with all these ghost foods. These recipes carried forward by the living as a form of memorial of testimony of refusal to let death have the final word about who gets to feed us. There was someone's grandmother's lasagna, another person's father's barbecue sauce, a friend's signature cocktail, a mother's chocolate cake, and as we ate, we told the stories behind the dishes, the contexts in which we'd first tasted them, the hands that had prepared them, the voices that had explained the recipes, the love that had motivated their creation. Food is memory made tangible. I thought, history you can taste, the past literally embodied in the present through the continuation of recipes, techniques, traditions. When you eat your grandmother's cookies, you're not just eating flour and sugar and butter. You're eating her childhood, Christmases, her mother's instructions, her own children's birthdays, her decision to add an extra teaspoon of vanilla, her hands, shaping the dough, her belief that love could be baked and consumed and would nourish not just bodies but souls. I talked to a chef who specialized in memorial dinners events where she'd recreate deceased people's favorite meals for their surviving. Family members researching recipes, hunting down specific ingredients, attempting to resurrect through cooking the exact tastes, smells, textures that the dead had loved. She said it was the most emotionally difficult work she'd ever done, that clients would break down, crying over a perfectly executed pot roast that she watched grown men sob into their plates because she managed to replicate their mother's exact method of seasoning chicken. But she believed in the work. She told me, believed that these meals were a form of resurrection, however temporary, that for the duration of dinner, the dead were actually present, actually feeding their loved ones one last time, actually continuing to perform the fundamental act of care that defines what it means to be family. The empty chair across from the person eating might be empty, she said, but the plate in front of them was full, and that fullness came from the dead, from their knowledge, their skills, their particular way of loving through feeding. I started thinking about all the ways we feed our dead, not just through place settings, but through the continuation of their preferences, their dietary restrictions, their favorite foods even when they're not there to eat them. How many widows still buy their deceased husband's preferred brands of coffee, still avoid the foods they disliked, still organize their pantries according to systems the dead established? How many orphans still cook according to their parents' methods, still hear their voices correcting techniques, still measure ingredients by memory of hands that are now just bones? The dead are the most demanding guests, I realized, because they require everything but consume nothing, because they insist on presence without offering participation, because they transform every meal into a memorial service, whether we want them to or not. You cannot uninvite your ghosts, cannot ask them to leave, cannot enforce boundaries with the dead the way you can with the living, and so they accumulate year after year, decade after decade, until your table is more crowded with the absent than the present, until you're eating in a room full of empty chairs, each one holding someone who refuses to be forgotten. I attended a Quaker silent meal, where 20 of us sat around a long table and ate without speaking, and in that silence, I became acutely aware of absence, of all the noise that usually covers the sound of empty chairs, of all the conversation and laughter and arguments that distract us from noticing who isn't there. In the quiet, I could hear them, the missing, their absence so loud it drowned out the scrape of forks on plates, the rustle of napkins, the breathing of the living, and I understood why we talk during meals, why we fill the air with words and music and the television in the background, because silence makes room for ghosts, and most of us have more ghosts than we can stand to acknowledge. A historian told me about Victorian mourning practices, how the bereaved would wear black for years, how they keep locks of the deceased's hair and jewelry, how they maintain elaborate rituals of memorial that seem excessive to our modern sensibilities, but were really just honest, just an open acknowledgement that death changes everything, that losing someone requires years of adjustment. That grief isn't something you feel for a few weeks then get over, but something you wear, something you carry, something you build your life around. We've lost that honesty, she said, replaced it with this expectation that people should bounce back, quickly, should be functional and pleasant, and past it within months, should definitely not be setting places at the table for people who are obviously empirically verifiably dead. But the Victorians understood something we've forgotten, which is that the dead don't leave. They just stop responding, stop eating, stop occupying their chairs in ways that others can perceive. And if that's death, if that's what it means to be gone, then maybe setting an extra place is the sanest response, the most rational acknowledgement of an irrational situation. I interviewed a family who kept their son in his bedroom, exactly as it was when he died at 17, his clothes still in the closet, his posters still on the walls, his bed made his desk set up as if he might walk in any moment and sit down to do homework. Outsiders called it a shrine, called it unhealthy, said the family needed to move on, to let go, to accept reality. But when I asked them about it, they said the room wasn't a denial of death, but an affirmation of life. A testimony that he'd existed, mattered, taken up space in their home, in their hearts. And they saw no reason to erase that evidence, just because other people were uncomfortable with their method of mourning. They'd moved his place at the table into storage, though, the mother told me, because that was too painful, too much a reminder that he'd never eat with them again, never ask for seconds, never complain about the vegetables, never steal bites off his sister's plate when he thought no one was looking. The bedroom could stay exactly as it was, because it was static, frozen, a museum of past moments. But the table was active, ongoing, a site of continued life. In his absence, it was too loud, too disruptive, too honest about what death actually means. I thought about that distinction, a lot about which absences we can tolerate and which ones we have to eliminate, and I realized it's different for everyone, that there's no right way to arrange your relationship with your dead, no proper method for seating your ghosts. Some people need the empty chair to make sense of dinner, need the visual reminder of who's missing to justify why the meal tastes wrong, why the conversation feels incomplete, why they can't remember how to enjoy eating anymore. Other people need the chair removed immediately, need to visually reset the table to match their new reality, need to practice eating in a world that no longer includes the person they've lost. Both approaches are valid, a grief counselor told me. Both are ways of honoring a relationship while acknowledging its transformation. And the worst thing we do to grieving people is insist there is a right way to do this, a proper timeline for removing place settings, an appropriate duration for keeping chairs empty. Everyone has to find their own pace, their own method, their own way of gradually transitioning from setting a place for someone to accepting that they'll never arrive. But what about the people who never arrive? I wondered. The ones who aren't dead, but might as well be. The estranged family members, the ex-lovers, the friends who drifted away, the children who stopped calling. Do we set places for them, hold seats for their potential return, or do we fill their chairs immediately, claim their absence as abandonment rather than tragedy, refuse them the courtesy we'd extend to the dead? I talked to a woman whose adult daughter had cut off all contact 15 years ago, and she still set a place for her at every holiday meal, still bought birthday presents that went unsent, still maintained a relationship with someone who'd made it clear she wanted no relationship at all. It looked pathetic from the outside. The woman admitted this refusal to accept rejection, this insistence on loving someone who didn't love her back. But she said the alternative was worse, was giving up, was saying that her daughter was dead to her. And she couldn't do that, wouldn't do that, would rather be pathetic than give up hope that someday that empty chair might be filled again. Hope is what makes empty chairs unbearable. I realized hope is what transforms them from simple absences into accusations, into questions, into possibilities that torture us with their refusal to resolve into certainties. The truly dead stay gone, but the merely absent might return, might walk through the door one day and ask why we moved their chair, why we gave up on them, why we decided they weren't worth waiting for. I attended a dinner for people with missing family members, those lost to addiction, mental illness, incarceration, estrangement, and the grief in that room was different from the grief of the bereaved, sharper somehow, more bitter, because at least the dead have an excuse for their absence. At least they didn't choose to leave. At least you can tell yourself they'd be there if they could. But the missing have chosen something other than you have decided that whatever drove them away was more important than the relationship you thought you had, and their empty chairs aren't just absent. They're accusatory, they're evidence of failure, of insufficiency, of the unbridgeable, distance between people who should be family, but somehow aren't. A man told a story about his brother, homeless and addicted, who'd show up randomly to holiday dinners. Years between appearances, dirty and desperate, and sometimes high, and how the family had debated whether to set a place for him or not, whether his unpredictability warranted a permanent chair, or whether that chair should only appear when he did. They'd tried both methods, he said, and neither felt right, because his brother's absence wasn't really absence. It was presence elsewhere. It was a choice to be anywhere but here, with them, at this table, and they couldn't figure out whether that deserved a place setting or an empty space that signified nothing but his refusal to fill it. The worst tables are the ones full of people who don't want to be there, I thought. People physically present but emotionally absent, going through the motions of family dinner while actually being 1,000 miles away, thinking about other places, other people, other lives they'd rather be living. Those tables are full of empty chairs, despite being completely occupied, full of ghosts who haven't died yet, haven't even left, but are already gone in all the ways that matter. I started noticing this everywhere, this phenomenon of present absence of people at tables, but not really there, scrolling on their phones, responding to work. Emails having entire conversations with people not at the table, while ignoring those who are. We've created new kinds of empty chairs, I realized, new forms of absence that don't require anyone to actually leave, that allow us to vanish while remaining visible, to absent ourselves from meals without missing them. A family therapist told me that one of the most common complaints she hears is about phones at the dinner table, about family members who are technically present, but actually somewhere else entirely, about the feeling of eating alone, even when surrounded by people, about the way technology has created absences more profound than death, because at least the dead have a reason for not paying attention to you. But the person across the table, choosing their screen over your face, is making an active decision about your worth, your importance, your right to their presence. Maybe we need to start setting empty places for our living selves, I thought, for the attention we withhold, the presence we refuse to offer, the ways we ghost each other while sharing the same physical space. Maybe every table should have a chair for the person we could be if we were fully present, fully engaged, fully committed to the act of breaking bread together. And maybe that chair would be the emptiest of all the most accusatory, the one that reminds us we're capable of absences more profound than death could ever achieve. I went back to that first Thanksgiving after Marcus died, to that table with his untouched place setting, and I realized now that the problem wasn't his empty chair, but ours. The way my father and mother and I had been so consumed by grief that we made ourselves absent, had turned ourselves into ghosts haunting our own dinner, had forgotten that being alive requires presence, requires showing up, requires filling your own chair, even when everyone else's stays empty. My mother started hosting dinners again, about 2 years after. Marcus died, big elaborate meals with extended family and friends, and I noticed she always set the table with extra places, more chairs than she, needed more plates than there were people not for. Marcus specifically, but for absence in general. for the acknowledgement that every table is incomplete. Every gathering is missing someone. Every meal is attended by ghosts, whether we admit it or not. The extra places aren't pathological. I realized they're honest. They're a recognition that we're all eating with the dead, the missing, the lost. And pretending otherwise doesn't make us healthier, just more lonely. I started hosting my own dinners, inviting friends over for meals that always included at least one empty chair, one extra place, and I'd ask guests to tell me who they'd seat there if they could, who was missing from their table, who they wished to join us. The stories that emerged from those conversations were revelatory, painful, beautiful, a collective unburdening of absence that transformed dinner from a mundane activity into something sacred, something honest, something that acknowledged we all carrying our dead with us everywhere we go, and maybe it is time we stop pretending otherwise. One guest told me about her miscarriage, how she still thinks about that child at every family meal, how she calculates how old they'd be, now what they'd be eating, what they'd have to say, how that invisible presence shapes every gathering, even though no one knows to count them. Another talked about his estranged father, how he spent 30 years trying not to miss someone who'd never been there in the first place, how the empty chair in his life had been empty from the beginning, but he still couldn't stop wishing it would somehow fill. The empty chairs are where we keep our grief. I realized our regret, our hope, our love that has nowhere else to go, and acknowledging them doesn't make us broken. It makes us human, makes us members of the oldest tradition there is, which is feeding the dead, holding space for the absent, refusing to let death and distance and time have the final word about who gets to sit at our table. We are all of us eating with ghosts, all of us navigating around empty chairs, and the question isn't whether we should stop, but whether we can. Do it with more grace, more honesty, more compassion for ourselves and for others who are doing the same impossible thing, which is figuring out how to keep living in the presence of so much absence, how to keep eating when half the table is empty, how to find nourishment in meals that taste like grief and memory, and love that persists past any reasonable endpoint. The fork in my hand is steady now as I look at the chair across from me, the one I've kept empty, not from delusion, but from devotion, not from denial, but from defiance against the forgetting that death tries to impose. This is my table, these are my ghosts. This is how I choose to honor the fact that everyone who's ever sat here, who's ever eaten with me, who's ever mattered enough to occupy space in my home, and my heart deserves a place, deserves acknowledgement, deserves to be remembered as someone who was here, who was important, who filled a chair that remains empty now, but not meaningless, not purposeless, not just absence, but evidence of presence proof. That we were together once, that we shared this most basic human activity, that we fed each other, nourished each other, kept each other alive for as long as we could before death or distance or time pulled us apart. The meal begins, and I eat in good company, surrounded by everyone who's missing, who's always missing, who'll be missing from every table for the rest of my life. And I am grateful for their absence because it means they were present once, means they mattered enough to leave a space that nothing else can fill, means that every meal is a memorial, and every memorial is a meal, feeding the living and the dead alike, keeping us all at the table together, even when we're apart, refusing to accept that love ends when presence does, insisting that absence is just another way of being here, just another chair at the feast.